Hello everyone, thank you for joining us and thanks to Muthu for agreeing to do this session. You know that this session, today's webinar is part of our 20 plus episode series on product management. This is the 10th episode where we are going to talk about the nuances of product lifecycle management from the point of view of the product development. So Muthu is going to cover how to manage product lifecycle from the point of view of the product development. Few announcements before we could start. Please do leave us your feedback like every time you do. That helps us to improvise and curate more topics for the community. And we come to know how are you liking it or not liking it, and we can improvise on those. My name is Vibhor Bansal. I'll be a host for the day, and Muthu is going to make a presentation, not taking much of a time. Before I hand it over to Muthu, just one more thing. You can send us your questions in between in the chat box, and I'll keep on assigning them to Muthu wherever we see the relevance. Thank you everyone. Muthu, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Vibhor. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar in the Product Connect series. Today's topic is going to be around product lifecycle management with more focus on the product development aspects, the starting phase of the product. Right. So before we go into the session, just to also to put up a face of who is talking to you. Actually, myself Muthu. I work as a product manager at SAP Labs India here in Bangalore. I'm also a design thinking coach and a product innovation coach, known in the startup community of Bangalore as well. I'm also part of the product managers forum and the product leadership forum, that is something at the national level. So I actually started from a technical background, right from the product development to the product research aspects, and also spent some time in the product quality management, project management, and now in the product management. So probably I can, with my experience, try and cover the broad aspects of the product management, the life cycle of a software product in specific, and typically also with the focus onto the product development area. So as you know, this whole topic is very broad. It has too many flavors into it. We may not be able to cover all of that in let's say an hour or so. So we will I'll try and keep it short. So for example, the primary aspects of whichever could be very useful, could be useful for you when you are developing a product in your organization. And then at the end, I will also open it up for questions where you can ask for something specific, right? So yeah, so let's start with basically what a product is, right? So there is no product, for example, if there is no users or customers. It all starts with an user, someone who is using your application, and customer, someone who is paying for your application. At times these are one and the same. At times these are different, because there's someone buying and someone else on behalf is using that application. So that's why it all starts with the user and the customer. And then he has a problem or some experience which could have been better, right? So he is going through something currently today which could have been better, or he has a problem which could be potentially be solved. So this creates the opportunity for creating a product. Now the product is typically a value that is being generated, or a value proposition that we are able to deliver to these users and customers, so that the problem that they are currently facing, or the experience that they are currently going through, can be improved, right? So that's where the product comes into a picture. Now, if this product, which is delivering the value, can help generate a revenue for an entity. That's the company which is building the product, right? So it all starts with the user, and then the end of the day, the company should be able to make money out of it. That's when a product becomes successful, right? So this is the 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 basic aspect of the product. And now, if we actually see the life cycle of the product, it goes through a variety of phases. Starting right from the conceptualization to where the business cases and the is prepared, and then there is typically talks with the product portfolio team to get the investment happen, etc. And then the whole development phase starts. Right, the once the development is done, the including all the testing aspects and beta testing and everything, there is a launch that is happening. The market introduction, that's where we primarily get the product market feeler out of the launch of the product. And then the product typically starts to grow, or the hope is that the product should grow after that phase, after such a phase, right? And then typically it hits a maturity at some point in time. And then, as a matter of fact, we have to also agree that no product can ever be forever. There is always some life cycle to the product. At a point, it will start to decline, either because a new competitor has come, or even the company itself has a new and better product to offer right now to the customers. And hence, there's a decline that is starting to happen, and the end of life for the product, or typically what we also call in organizations as a sunset of the product, right? So right from the conceptualization, development, launch to the sunset of the product, there is a broad spectrum of life cycle that a typical software product goes through. Now, this itself is if we take this as a primary topic, right? So there is a lot of aspects around the product life cycle that we can talk about. But then for today's session, we will try and keep the focus on the first part, which is how you start from the conceptualization to the development of the product. Some of the techniques that can be used to develop the product. That's what we had also put in the session, for example, when we had put up for sign up. So things like, for example, how do you better manage the Scrum processes, the product backlog, till the time the launch of the product happens, right? So that's going to be this area is going to be the primary focus for today's topic. um, I'm sure that most of you would have heard, or definitely worked even also with the waterfall model, provided you're from some of the software engineering area, and you have been coding or developing, creating products. You would have definitely gone through this. You know, it worked all well, right? So till a certain point in time, it all worked very well. That we keep on doing the requirements, and then it flows to the design, and then it flows to the coding. One step has to be completed before the next step can start. That's the whole essence of the waterfall stuff, right? And then the primary reason it has started to fail is also that there is a high delay in the delivery of the product, because we are keeping in the room everything to us. We are sitting within the four walls of the organization. So right from the business case to the development of the product to the testing of the product, so everything is happening within in-house of the organization, right? And then we are just delaying the whole delivery. For example, even from our company, we used to launch product like once in every 1.5 years, right? So that's 18 months is used to be the cycle that we develop a product and then we launch a product, right? So that means that we had collected some requirements 18 months back from the market, and then we had been developing all through the while. And then suddenly 18 months later, there is a product which has been launched in the market with big advertisements and launch and everything, and then we directly talk about the product. Now there is two things that can happen: either the product is a huge hit, or it is a complete flap, or there is the demand for the market has already changed, or the competitor has already come and taken over the market, right? So which means it's a huge risk that either you could win or you could also heavily lose when you are actually launching the product, right? So that's where this whole the agile concept started coming into the industry, from the whole aspect of not delaying the uh, not delaying the whole product delivery aspect. So the key is to, as soon as and as early as possible in the product's life cycle, we are able to deliver a product increment to the market to see how the response is going on, right? So if you see, at every possible and a logical time frame, we are doing a product increment and we are launching into the market, and then see how the response is, and based on that, either you would recall the product, or you would actually add some more value into the product, and then the product keeps growing, right? So that's the whole shift that has happened in the industry. Now, if we see the whole agile, it is with the there's a lot of aspects about the agile, but if we go to the basics, there is this four key manifesto that the whole agile concepts talks about. If you go to, for example, agilemanifesto.org, the pure manifesto that the agile talks about, right? So these four are very simple principles or manifestos to be kept in mind when we follow the agile mindset, for example, while developing any product for that matter, right? So this is, the ones on the left gets higher value than the ones on the right? So that's the whole beauty of these sentences, right? So the individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? Working software over comprehensive documentation. So you are sitting and developing exhaustive documentation for the whole release of the product for the next 3 years or 5 years, and then, by the time, what about your product increment that you could have already delivered even with the smallest amount of features, and see the reaction in the market, right? Customer collaboration over the contract negotiation, and responding to a change over following a plan. Yeah. So making a release plan, for example, if this is set, it doesn't mean that we will only do what the feature that we have committed, and then we will only on deliver that, but then the responding to the change completely, um, for example, even for the product that I am building currently in my organization, for example, there was an acquisition that recently happened, and then we knew immediately that there are some aspects of what from my team we were planning to develop is already there, and some pieces had been already existing in the new company that we acquired recently, right? So does it make sense for us to even still go ahead and keep developing the features that we have already planned? We didn't do that, right? So what we did is we immediately called off the development. We took some time. We saw, in the full details of, at least till whatever details that we could get. Because, for example, when one company, specifically when a big company takes over on another company, right, there is some legal things to be sorted out before you can actually see what exactly they are developing. But using the public materials, for example, we can already see what is the direction they are going, and what direction we could take for our product, so that there is no contradiction that is happening. Rather, we can actually build it in a complementing way, right? So that's why it is very important also to responding to the change. So if we relate it back to the engineering practices, right? So Scrum was one of the methodologies started as adoption of these principles in the manifestos that the Agile is talking about, applied to a product development aspect, right? And then soon, Scrum became one of the most successful methodologies, evolved to a general framework for developing and sustaining complex products of any nature, right? So that's where, for example, I mean, not in all context and in all places Scrum is going to be perfectly working fine, but in typically in the software development, for example, it has worked very well. And then in our company, for example, all the team follows Scrum, right? So it also gives the organizations the flexibility in choosing the appropriate engineering practices, right? So it is not talking about specifically this is the engineering practice that it should apply. It only talks about the quality, the values, and and the principles, and not exactly onto the engineering practices. So it gives you the flexibility to apply your own engineering practices on top of it, right? So again, not to be confused, the two words, the agile and scrum, because when scrum started becoming popular, right, a lot of people had this whole assumption of these are just one and the same, and we are following scrum, that means we are agile, right? So just to be more careful over there, there are several agile methodologies lying in the market, right? And scrum is just one of them, right? So scrum is one. We have kanban, for example. There is even a combined hybrid frameworks. Scrumban is available. There is feature driven development. There is plenty of other several agile methodologies which is existing in the market. Even within the software product development umbrella, some of these methods can be taken and can be used, for example, right? So which one works the best will depend on the context and the environment and the type of product that you are building. So based on that, you would have to do an exercise to figure out, for example, which methodology would fit you the most to help you become agile within your company while you are building your product, right? So for this session today, we are primarily going to focus around Scrum, while there are other methods also that we could talk about. Primarily our focus for a limited time over today is that onto the Scrum aspects. Now, if we see the basics of Agile, right? So the three key pillars that Agile talks about is to achieve the transparency, the inspection, and the adaptation to the change that you could do on a continuous cycle, right? And then Scrum helps you to, for example, Scrum as a methodology to help you to become agile using these core Scrum values. It helps you to achieve these three major pillars of Agile that we are talking about. The key Scrum values are the courage to do something, the focus that you always keep on to deliver something, the commitment, the respect for all the team members, and everyone is empowered and they can pull in the task from the Scrum board, for example. And then the openness, who is doing what is blocked at what point in time, and the board is visible to the entire team who is working on developing that product, for example. So there is always openness and the trust and the transparency that is created. So Scrum helps you to achieve that when you try to achieve to be agile within your software product development, for example, right? So if we specifically talk about the software product craftsmanship, then the manifesto, even the key Agile manifesto that we saw, for example, if that could be little bit adopted to very specific to software product craftsmanship, then I would say we are not just talking about working software, but we are talking about well crafted software, right? So working software is good. There is this whole concept around usable software. At the end of the day, every day, if you are checking into your pipeline, there should be a test server for your team, and in the test server, if you access the product, it should be a usable working software, right? That's a good philosophy to be followed. But is it just the working software that matters? It is also the well crafted software that you should try and achieve, even if not at the full slaw, at the whole basis at the same time. Even if it is small steps, there has to be steps taken towards a well crafted software which provides the end to end experience, or the better experience for the customer, taking care even about, for example, the user journey for the product that you are creating, right? So not just responding to a change, but steadily adding value, right? So it is in the current situation, it is not just that, okay, there is a change, there is a new player coming in, so I have to change the plan, I have to do something, right? I have to this option is not working out, I will do this, right? It is not just responding to a change, but then also steadily adding value, increasing the value proposition of your product incrementally, so that every product increment that you are delivering also adds on some experience and some value to your user, so your user is always looking forward to receive the next version of your product, right? not only individuals and interactions, but also a community of professionals, right? We always try, at least in the whole B2B ecosystem, right? So in our case, for example, within our company, we always try and see if we can actually have this community of professionals, because for SAP, one of our stronghold is our community of professionals which are outside in the world, in the ecosystem, who is supporting us to grow, right? So it is not only the internal interactions that we are seeing, but we are also thinking about, for example, what should be the how we build our community of professionals around, for example, right? If that is something fitting also in your context, you could also think about it, for example, right? Not only customer collaboration, but also productive partnerships, right? So it is not, I mean, your product does not exist in silo anywhere, right? It is not just a solo stuff, even though it is it is designed for doing one thing, right? There could be something in before of this or something after of this is typically required, except a few cases where it is purely cutthroat single functionality delivering software. Most of the time what happens is there is a user journey, and the user journey is bigger than what your product only can offer, right? So there is always some room for some partnerships to you that you can partner with another application, another product, another company, for example, to constantly add value and to build a ecosystem in a way that that you both have a win-win situation, right? So that is something you can always try and see if this is something that is achievable for your product, for that matter, right? So this is in specific for the software product craftsmanship, based on our experience of building the products here. Some of the things that we have seen working, right? So if we specifically see the product development life cycle, so if you remember this curve, we already talked about this curve, right? From the development to the launch to the growth that is happening, and the sunset of the product that is happening at the end of the line, right? So in the product development life cycle, one of the critical element is the product backlog. Basically nothing but what are the functionalities, or what are the things that you should be developing, right? Which is written in a specific format, what we call as a product backlog, right? So from the product backlog, you will start to pull items one by one, and you start to create the features for the product, which will become your which will keep on becoming your product increment. And then based on how the market is reacting, you would do some changes, you would add some more value, and the whole thing continues, right? And as we are talking about Scrum in this specific session, as a method to have agile in your product development, we are talking about a Scrum sort of a setup, which is there is typically a product owner, and then the development team members, and there is a Scrum master. Right now, the team of 10, for example, in our company typically also includes, there is also a data scientist, and there is also a DevOps person, right? So these two colleagues have become a new addition in the last 6 months to 1 year. That we have this concept of team of 10. Each team of 10 is independent. They are able to deliver up one product or a portion of the product, or a logical portion of the product, and then they are self-sufficient with the product owner and the developers and the Scrum master. Now added these two people also, right? So that's a typical setup. So this product backlog, for example, what will start to happen is that till the time when you are still in this maturing phase or the evolving phase, right? Is where you will have less and less detail in the backlog. It doesn't mean that the backlog itself does not talk about what to be developed. It will talk about all the things to be developed, but then it will have lesser detail, so that there is always space and room for you to improvise in the last minute. You can respond to a change, for example, etc. And then when the product becomes more and more mature, the backlog details will start to will start to, for example, it will have complete concrete details, for example, right? So yeah. So from there, if we actually see the building blocks of developing a product in the Scrum and the Agile way, for example, if you have a look at this kind of a building block for building this product, then it all starts from epic, and then there is some user stories, what we call as user stories underneath, and then it is broken down into BLIs, the backlog items, and after a BLI there could even be some of the task and subtask, and there can be even, for example, some bugs under some of these BLIs also, right? So that forms your overall building blocks for building your product, right? Starting from epic to story to BLI to task. Now, what is an epic? Epic is typically a large body of work that can be, this is a large functional unit of the product. Most of the time, it's a functional unit of the product. Sometimes what happens is, even for the one release, there will be only one epic. Sometimes within a release, there will be different functional units of the same product. So you will have multiple epics. And sometimes you would need to create one epic below another epic also in some situations, right? So relatively, these are undefined at a very high level, and these are too large to complete in a single iteration, right? These epics are not something that can be taken by one team or one person and done in a specific amount of time, right? So it is typically relatively undefined and too large to accommodate within a sprint, for example, right? So epics is the first building block that you would start from. Now that you have the epic, the second step what you would do is a user story, right? So user story typically has a format, something like this, right? As a person, typically a role or a persona, whom we are building the software for or the product for, that person wants something, right? There is some intention, there is some wanting that is happening, so that he can achieve some value or benefit out of the value proposition that we are offering through our product, right? So every functionality or a feature in your product, so you should be able to quantify, for example, how it increases the value to your user, right? So that's why we start to think from the user's point of view. As this person who is going to be the user, what does he want, so that he can achieve what, right? So that is the typical user story format, for example, right? So as an online shopper, for example, I want to know the order number so that I can track and cancel my order. It's a sample user story, right? So if you see, ideally in the software development aspect, what would have happened is that you would have done a business case, you would have spoken to some of your users, interviewed some of them, and based on that, the first thing that you would have got is a persona. Now, persona is not one person, is not one user of your product, but it is a role that can talk for a group of users, one group of user that is going to use your product, right? Like, let's say, for example, Jaira is the product manager is a persona. Now, product manager, there can be so many different product managers. By speaking to, let's say, 10 of them, you can arrive at a typical product manager persona. So if I am building a software called Jaira, then I am building it for a persona called product manager. And then I should be able to define this persona based on the interviews and the discussions I had with the product manager, for example. Right. So that's where we started from. Um, so on the other side, what happens is user story alone will not take care of your user experience, because this is one of the very typical mistake that happens when we build the products with this typical epic user story backlog item way. It is all good, it is all fine, but one thing that is generally missed is that the whole user experience aspect, right? For example, what happens is user story typically talks about the functional value or a functionality of what they want to achieve and what the value it brings. But how about while delivering that value to the user, what is the journey he is going through? What he has already done, what he has not done, and at what step he is coming and doing this particular step that you are talking about now in the user story, and how he will do it or how he will react to it, right? So that is typically will happen only if you do what we call as a user journey. So for example, you could do, for example, a day in life of your user to see the user journey, or you could do a workflow, for example, if this is a process system that you are building, after which process is happening, and then where is an approval happening, etc. um, or you could do a storyboard, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, kind of a template you might have probably seen in different places. So basically, what was the scene before something has happened, after something has happened, that could help you to think from the shoes of your customer, so that you can add that user experience element into the functionality that you are building, for example, right? And not to be ignored also the visual design aspects, including the mockups and sketches. Right. So one interesting thing, for example, here is that uh, why I would prefer, let's say, a sketch over a mockup is that if you go to a user, typically when you are building a product, you want to validate some functionality, you want to see how something is done, right? So if you do already a mockup, for example, using InVision or any of the prototyping tools, for example, which looks like your final product, and then go to your user or customer, typically most of the questions or the feedback that you would be getting is around, for example, why is this font like this, why the button is here, why the button, can we not do the UI little more fancy, all such kind of comments typically comes up, right? So that's where it is also important to um, do the sketches when you are still in the validation phase of your product, where you can actually go and present the sketch of your concept, sketch of how your screen could look at, and then specifically talk about the functionality that you would want to improve based on the interaction that you are having with your customers. Right. Now, another thing to be noted here, as we were talking about the whole persona, user interviews, etc. In this B2B aspect, right? I'm sure if most of you would have been also from B2B background, I'm sure you would have faced this whole challenge around how do you find your end user, right? This is a very big challenge, for example, in our organization, right? So if you're building a B2C product, the easiest thing that you can ever do is finding an end user. You can direct, for example, if you are building a e-commerce website, if you are building a something like delivery service, food delivery service, each and everyone you see around you is probably a consumer for the service that you're building, the product that you're building. So it is easiest for you to go and interview, let's say, 50 people, 100 people around your consumers, who are typically around fall in your area of your consumers, and then get a good view out of what you want to build, for example, right? But B2B is very, very tricky in this area, right? So for a product, for a typical product that we start to develop, generally we have one co-innovation customer, or maximum 2 3 customers who are actually also involved in the design involvement of the product right from the beginning itself, right? Very rarely some of the products have got up to 10 customers or so at the beginning itself who are interested with the concept, right? So this is where the whole thing starts. Now they will give you access to what we call as the business users or the IT admin users, right? So generally, someone who will buy your software or someone who will implement your software is the person whom you will get access to, right? Unfortunately, these are not the guys who are going to use your software. Though they are of good importance to you, they are not the users of your software, right? But typically, in many of the B2B scenarios, what happens is you will be speaking to your customer who is going to buy or who is going to implement, and then they will give a lot of input as if they are going to use the software, and then we will build under that assumption, and there is a terrible product failure that happens at the end of the day, because the users do not have that requirement, or they have a different working environment altogether, which you have ignored to notice that they are not able to adapt to your product, right? So that is something that typically happens in a B2B product development. So it is very important, if you are in a B2B area, to make sure that your business user gets a buy-in about why you should talk to your end user. You have to convey the value of speaking to an end user. That's that's a complete different topic itself around. I would be happy if any of you are from B2B area, if you want to reach out to end user area, I would be happy to share some of the best practices of how you can make this happen. We actually even did a whole framework around how you can actually reach out to end users in your B2B area, and then successfully interact with them to get the insights out from them, right? So that's a topic that we can talk also separately if some of you are interested. Now, from user story, let me also show you a template that I typically use for entering my user stories and backlogs, right? So this is a template that I follow, a simple Excel template, though we have to enter everything into Jira. I would admit that, Jira is still not that friendly, right? So we also, for quick and easy access, we also maintain it in Excel, and then, for tracking purposes, we also put it into Jira, right? So there is typically a format like, for user ID, user stories, the ID of the story, so that you can track as a user what you want to perform so that you can achieve some goal, right? So this is a simple table that you can use to document your user story. Similarly, for your product backlog, right? So the name of the backlog, you can also have a number field, and typically if it is resulting from a user story, you can have your user story ID also linked here. And then whether it is sprint ready means that you have added sufficient detail in your backlog that it can be pulled into a sprint, for example. And priority, which is a very very important stuff, to be assigned for each of your product backlog item, and the story points, and whether it is assigned to the sprint already or not, right? So this is a template, for example, that you could follow for your product backlog, right? And timeline. So now that we talked about the different building blocks, it is also that, all these building blocks are finally taking you to that whole product development timeline till the time you launch your product, right? So this is a template, for example, that I use for managing my products, the timeline of the products, right? To the major block is to indicate that, which sprint are we in currently, and then all the weeks are entered at the top, and the different aspects of what we have to do on the left hand side. For example, we have two types of development, right? So in our organization, the custom development and the standard product development. So typically, what kind of development we are doing. So when, for example, the correction flows have to happen, the security validation aspects, hand over to production so that the software can be ready to be published. RTC, onboarding and testing. So right now, most of the software that you develop over cloud, it has to be finally, let's say, deployed in Azure or AWS, for example. So we even do a sample staging before the actual customer comes on board, so that, all the testing that is done is also done in a space in AWS, for example, which is close to your customer environment itself, right? So this is a sample timeline format, for example, that you could use for your product. Many such tools are also available in internet. There are many Excel templates also available. If you just Google for Agile Excel templates, Scrum Excel templates, you will find variety of them. It is only up to your creativity basically to fine tune them as to how you want to use them, and then you can start using it, right? So and there is also quite a bunch of softwares other than Jira also that you could also look at, if that fits your view, for example. So coming back, we talked about the backlog items, and what is also important is that the backlog refinement, right? So when we enter a story, we typically do what we call as the backlog item, where you enter some details about the task to be achieved, right? Now you need not do the complete detailing of that backlog at the time you are entering your first backlog item itself, right? But the refinement happens when you are getting closer to the sprint where you are actually going to pull it in, right? So first you will enter all the your backlogs, then you will prioritize all of them, and then based on the priority, you will start to assign them in your sprints. Will this be sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint n+1, n+2, n+3, etc. And then at least for the backlogs which you are going to put on into the sprint n+1, there has to be detail achieved, right? So best practice is either n+1 or till n+2. You should be having your backlog should be detailed enough so that your developers can actually pull it and start to work on it in the sprint, right? Now that we talked enough about the sprint, let me also tell you typically what we follow for the sprint length for the different products that we are building. Probably useful for some of you, depending on the type of product development that you are doing in your organization, right? So just for also the colleagues who are in the call who are still, who may not have heard about a sprint. For example, sprint is a set period of time during which a specific work has to be completed, right? And release is a planned time box during which a usable, releasable product increment is created. We in the whole agile area, we are not talking about one product launch, etc. We are always talking about product increment. There is a product and there is always a better version of the product possible, and then you will never try to deliver a load of feature in one release, two release. You will always release your features in an increment depending on how your market is reacting to your product, and that's why we call it the product increment, right? Now, what is a typical sprint length, right? There is no set rule for the sprint length. But then something that we are following is, for example, for a new product. Now, for example, the current product that I am responsible for is a new product that we are developing. And this is using machine learning aspects, etc. So there is a lot of new things that we are entering into, and then we actually have to take time to build some of these aspects. And as for the bigger organizations that you have to take care of a lot of product standards and quality standards and the corporate standards that cannot be mitigated even if you want to deliver a smallest functionality, right? So we have decided for the for some of these special cases we can only have 2 releases per year, right? So then typically for this 2 release per year, we also tend to go with the 2 week sprints, right? And these are the early phases of the product, and some of the early phase of the product where the product is not that complex in nature, it can have 4 releases per year, which is basically every quarter there is a release. And then this is also typically a 2 week sprint length that we follow, right? And then when the product starts getting matured, there is even eight releases per year. There is even 12 releases per year that we are working on, which is every month there is a release. Some of the teams are even trying to go into weekly release. That is something that they are trying on to achieve in a B2B environment. This is what is from the our organization perspective, right? But if you actually speak from industry perspective, there are companies which ships even software every day, right? For example, Hotstar, you would have seen this advertisements from Hotstar, right? So they ship their productive software every day. And if you talk about any typical cloud software, for example, all your Google services that you are using, and all those Uber services that you are using, etc. All these are getting updated every year, every day. You probably may not even notice that a new functionality has now been added, right? But it has already happened behind the scenes for you, right? So that's now the speed with the over the air updates and the cloud that is bringing in for us. So the key anyway is to have a continuous delivery enabled right from the day one. When you are actually starting to build your product, you are not thinking about the recommendation is not to think about I'm building a product, these are the functionalities of the product, let me launch and then see, then we will finally see if at all there has to be an n+1 release, right? Start already to think about the continuous delivery aspects, right? In today's world, there is nothing like a perfect product launch where you sit inside the room to develop the iPhone for 2 years, 3 years out of your full research, and then directly launch and still make a big hit, right? So there has to be continuous delivery aspects. There has to be the product increments that you are able to deliver every now and then to your users, and you are able to make your product a habit with your users. Okay, so once you define the release timeline, and then accordingly your sprint length, now you will also decide, for example, what can be done within the sprint. So basically, you will start to pull the items from your ordered backlog, and then you will work together with the team to see how the work can be achieved within that sprint, which is typically the sprint planning meeting that happens. And during the sprint, for example, it is I mean, to achieve agility, it is very, very important that you are able to measure and adjust on a daily basis, typically on a daily basis, that what we call as a stand-up meeting, that your team is able to come together and quickly able to say, what are they working on, if they have any blockers, and they are able to move in typically a scrum board. Though if you have a Jira, if you can have a physical board, that is even better. You can physically move some task which is done to from to do to done, for example, right? So that's something that you do on a daily basis. Now, what happens at the end of it? There is definition of done and there is acceptance criteria. End of day, these two terminologies are nothing more than a clear and concise list of conditions that needs to be satisfied so that you can accept a piece of work which has been done, right? And these conditions, for example, has to be agreed between the product owner and the development and the product development team that you are working with. So let's take some examples, right? So for the done criteria, for example, you would typically, these are typically at a group of items, right? So done criteria is defined at either at the epic level or at a group of items level. So it will talk about bigger tangible outcomes, like something like, for example, documentation, user assistance should be in place, end-to-end response time or the performance of the product should have been improved by so and so KPI. 400 millisecond has to be met. Whatever, all these bigger items as a done criteria, for example. Your acceptance criteria will typically be at a granular level. Given, for example, given I'm 18 years old, when I want to create an account, then I get an error message, right? So this is typically, for example, a sample acceptance criteria that we use, for example, right? This is at a very, very granular story level or a backlog item level, where you typically say, for this item, if the work assigned to this item has been done, then I would say this item can be accepted if you are able to if I log in and I say I'm less than 18 years old, I should be able to get an error message. Only then this item is completed. So that's the acceptance criteria, for example. Okay, so now a quick reflection. So we actually started from, why this whole the whole we actually started from the product itself, and then the life cycle of the product, and then to manage the life cycle of products, how earlier we were with the waterfall method and then moved on to the agile methods, and scrum as one of the adaptation or a methodology for agile, how it is helping you to develop a software product in an organization. And then some of the building blocks we saw for building the product, which is right from starting from epic to user stories to backlog items, and the how you adjust within a sprint, the sprint length, and the done and acceptance criteria, right? We also saw some formats of how you can enter some of these backlog items, right? Or some of these building blocks, for example. Now, with that, if you actually see, typically there is an idea or a business case, and then which is getting approved by the product development team. Then you are breaking that down into functionally large units, what we call as epics, right? And then that is further broken down into user stories. Not to forget also the user experience here, which means you should also consider not just the user story, the functional aspects, but also building a persona, and then have your ability to have your workflow sketches, etc. And then the task level detail for all of these items, which is getting pulled into a sprint. End of the day, what goes into a sprint, comes out at the release at your defined release item as a product increment, which is then delivering your set value proposition to your customers and users, right? So this is what we talked about today in a brief. So some of the key focus areas before I wind off in the whole product development aspect. There are a few key questions that you have to answer in this whole phase, which is, what functionality you are providing and when. That is very, very important, and how to build that into your product, into and thinking right from the beginning on product increment and not just one version of the product, right? What are the key artifacts? Some of the artifacts that we talked about: the product backlog, product increments, and the release burn down. When you are doing your Scrum, your sprints, you can also plot down your release burn down with and see your velocity, for example, and how the speed at which you are able to burn your task, for example, right? Some of the key activities that happens in this whole product development phase, as we for a typical software product document, there is all definitely a lot of design discussions happening at the beginning, then the actual coding of the product, then the testing, there is a product demo happening. What we call in our organization, for example, a guided beta, which means we deliver a software to the customer for a free of cost trial, only for a fixed window. That window is typically only 3 days in our case. In your organization, depending on your complexity of the product and so on, it could be different ways of how you can do that. But doing a beta is very, very important, even if you are in B2B area, right? And doing early releases and the whole launch preparation. So till starting from the design to the launch preparation aspects is what we talked about in the product development aspects, right? And the team composition, as we talked about, the product owner plus the whole cross-functional development team. I would just leave it at cross-functional because, as I say, every once in a while, the number of the mix of people within the team is keep on changing. It's not just the developers, the quality people, and then DevOps coming in, and the data analysts coming in, etc. Right? So it's a cross-functional development team which is able to independently pick a product or a logical portion of the product and deliver on it. Right? So that's the aspect to be kept in mind. So those are the 4 areas that I would like to leave you with. So with
Thank
that,
you.
some further readings, while we send the materials, you would be able to see some of these links, for example, some of the frameworks. There's a lot of blogs around that you could read through and take insights around. There is a lot of formats available, what you could use, the frameworks, and etc. Roman Pitzler, for example, is a very, very good website. If you have not already been to visit it today, you would be able to find a lot of very good materials, which we typically refer for our product development aspects also. Right. With that, I would then move on to Vibor. So thank
Thank
you,
you, Muthu.
everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, so very well conducted, so much in detail and practical insights of life cycle, product life cycle. We have many questions. Most of them I see has been responded as part of your presentation, but we have 5-7 minutes if you would like to take a couple of those. I have shared those questions with you, or you want me to talk, read out to you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to open up the questions. Uh, yeah, I've opened up the questions. What is the significance of design thinking in product development? Okay, interesting question. So design thinking, if you see, is a broad umbrella. Typically, it adds more value if you could actually do it before your product development, actual standard product development starts, for example. There is a variety, there is different ways how you could use, for example, some of the best practices of design thinking mindset is something that you can still use within your product development. For example, always going back to the users to validate, always trying to find the real problem and not sticking to an idea. Those values of design thinking is something you can always follow irrespective of which phase of the product you are in. But if you want to do the full design thinking wave for a concept, then it is best done before the product development aspect, when you are still working on your business case. For example, you have found a very good problem area, and today, um, to emphasize again, today idea is not your IP, right? Find your ability to find your right problem is your IP, right? There is problems all around us, there is problems everywhere, every organization, right? Are you able to find the right problem which has the business potential? And then if you are able to go behind that problem and get actual insights about why that problem is happening, and if you are able to build your solution around it, that is exactly also the even the design thinking mindset emphasize, for example, right? So it is best done before your product development, but the values can still be used within the product development aspects. um, Difference between a product owner and a product manager. So typically, if different organization, it is structured differently. For example, if you go to a startup, for example, there is this one role called product manager who does everything, as in, they are writing even the product backlog, they are doing the user stories, they are speaking to the users, they are speaking to the engineers, they are preparing for the launch. Most of the aspects, the inbound product management and outbound product management, being done by them. But in most large companies, what happens is, typically the inbound product management is done by the product owner, and the outbound product management is done by the product manager, which means the product manager is looking at the new customers to be interacted with, generating some tractions for the product, working closely with the GTM colleagues and the sales colleagues, developing the business case, etc. Whereas the product owner is actually working on, there is now a high level requirement. Now, how do I break that requirement into a user story, for example, and a backlog item, for example? How do I prioritize? How do I best convey this to the developers so that they are able to take it up and deliver in a most efficient way, for example, right? So that's how it is done typically in a large companies. How do we identify end users in B2B2X? Okay, interesting question. So of course, yes. So the whole, I mean, if the first three letters is already B2B, it is already becoming difficult that you are not able to find your end users very easily, right? Because there is some abstraction that this business layer is bringing in the second business that you are interacting with, right? But in some of the cases, for example, in B2B2C, this is getting little bit simplified. For example, when we are building a e-commerce platform, we are building this platform for a company to host their products and their services to sell, right? But then end of the day, it is going to be, if we know, for example, it is going to be opened up to an end user who is going to buy a certain things, then we are actually being even able to do the final consumer persona, so that we can design our software accordingly. A typical example is SAP Hybris, if you know, if you have heard about it, our e-commerce platform, for example, right? So here, while we are building it for other companies to sell their products, we actually also keep in mind a typical persona who logs in, the customer's customer, so that we can design our product accordingly, right? So that's another thing to be noted there. So Vibor, how long can we go, or
Yeah, we can take one more question. Yeah.
okay. Yes, we would like to know how to reach out to end users for B2B product development. Yes, I would be happy to tell you some of the best practices that we have developed over the years and which we are now seeing it working. You can reach out to me in any of the channels mentioned, and then I would be happy to share you with. Um,
Okay.
okay.
Now, so it's time. We have so many questions. We can keep going in, and I don't think
Yeah.
that there's going to end. So,
Yeah.
thank you guys for your interest. It's been overwhelming response for this webinar, and so many questions. We'll try to address these with some other means, and I'll take the help from Muthu on that front. And thank you, Muthu. Thank you for preparing such a nice presentation, sharing your learnings and experiences with us. Uh, Dear attendees, please leave your feedback once you log out of the system as soon as webinar ends. This helps us a lot. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
You too.